In the studio, sitting across from me right now, we have Mike McCabe. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Carousel. Good to see you again.
So great to have you. You've served as the executive director of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, a nonpartisan watchdog group that tracks money and politics. You were there for 15 years. I had the pleasure of having you on my show when we talked about campaign finance laws. Before that, I like to mention this fun fact that you served years and years ago, decades ago, as a legislative staffer in the State House. You're also the author of Blue Jeans in High Places and the founder of Blue Jeans Nation. In fact, your website to Google, if you put into Google Mike McCabe for governor, the website is Governor Blue Jeans.
Yeah,
so that's still
GovernorBlueJeans.com, yeah.
Fundamental to what you are, and I want to talk about that.
Yep.
And you were born and raised in Wisconsin, grew up on a working farm, has lived in cities, but have also lived and spent parts of your childhood in small rural towns. Really have a mix of the sense of the combination of what Wisconsin is.
Yep.
And you're running for governor.
I am.
And if you go to your website, you've sort of positioned yourself as a bit of a Bernie Sanders type candidate. On your website, there's a video of Bernie speaking. I presume that's from Fighting Bob Fest?
It was, yeah.
I mean, when the two of you shared the stage together, and he was speaking favorably of you, and there's mention of Bernie Sanders on your Facebook page when people are invited to events and talking about the work that he did in this state and how you sort of emulate to do the same kind of work. So let's start. Give us an introduction. Why are you running for governor? What should we know about you? What motivated you to want to hold this position in Wisconsin?
Well, the work I did for so many years was aimed at trying to shake up and transform our political system to the point where regular people could actually have a voice and have a seat and be in the driver's seat of our government. And we now have a government that works so spectacularly well for those at the very top, a wealthy and well-connected and privileged few. But it leaves an awful lot of people behind. And my work over the years has really been about exposing and seeking to break the grip of big money influence on our politics and address the radical change in our political culture. Our political culture in Wisconsin has really been poisoned, and because of what's happened, especially in the 2016 elections, that those were jarring outcomes for a lot of people. And what I found is a lot of people around the state, hundreds and hundreds of people around the state, started saying, we really need somebody like you to run for governor. And my answer for quite a while was no. It was more like hell no. But the interesting thing, Carousel, is that all those people wouldn't take no for an answer. And that actually said a lot to me about how people are feeling and what they're yearning for. They simply wouldn't take no for an answer, and they kept pushing, and they started circulating petitions and doing online petitions on change.org and all kinds of things. And so I finally reached a point where I said, if you're willing to make this journey with me, I'll make the journey, but I can't do it alone. And here I am as a candidate for governor. It's not the path that I imagined taking, and I made it to age 57 without contemplating that path. But we live in a time where people, I think, are extraordinarily hungry for a very different kind of leadership and a new politics, and it's flattering and certainly flattering that they see some qualities in me that they are looking for. So here I am.
And tell me more when you say regular people, that the regular people you don't feel are at the table. The table, I feel, is so small of the leadership that to characterize everybody left over. Can you characterize all of us as regular people, people of color, women, working class, low class?
Yeah.
There's so many different levels to it. How do we all fit together?
But I think what makes everybody fit together, and obviously in that diversity there's enormous strength in our society, but we also have some things in common, as different as we are. And I think one of the dividing lines is the simple fact that less than 0.5% of all Americans supply more than 2/3 of all the political money in our society. all of the money that gets spent on campaign advertising, all the money that's raised and spent by those seeking public office, it's all supplied by less than 0.5% of the American population. So, when you run for governor, you can legally accept a $20,000 check from an individual and an $86,000 check from a political action committee. But most people I talk to have never had the habit of writing checks of that size and handing them to candidates for office. So the people who do have that habit are an extraordinarily tiny segment of our society. And all I know from all the work I've done all these decades is what they want our government to do is vastly different from what the rest of us want our government to do. And they get their way on issue after issue after issue. Their agenda is put into effect. They get their wishes on so many issues that we care about so deeply. And it's simply because they have that habit of writing those checks. And I personally, because of all the experience I've had, I view those checks the way I think most people view those checks. They see them as legal bribes. And we have to shake up and transform that system that has been overtaken by those few, a fraction of 1% of the American population that has outsized, oversized control over our government. We got to deal with that. I think that's the issue behind all the other issues.
No, you're running as a Democrat.
I am.
But you have written, and I think it was your book in 2014? Was it that long ago?
It was published in 2014.
2014.
Correct.
I had you on my show. I pulled up the audio. It was a great conversation. I encourage everybody to pull up you were on my show in October 2014, and I was looking at my notes and leafing through the book. And your criticism, which is, I think, very valid and very fair, which we talked about on the show, but it's aimed at both political parties. So I interpret it, and I think you perhaps will agree, it's aimed at one party more than the other, the Republicans more than the Democrats. But nevertheless, you found fault across the political system. Tell me how that fits in with your philosophy as running as a Democrat for governor of Wisconsin.
Well, I think my values and my positions on issues certainly align me more closely with Democrats and Republicans for sure. And we have a very strong two-party system in America. We don't have a parliamentary democracy. Mm-hmm. Second and third parties can't join forces and form coalition governments as they can in a parliamentary system. We don't have any kind of voting like instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting or proportional representation that would enable third parties to thrive and actually gain influence and governing power. We have a really strong two-party system. So I think we all have to think about how we can make the biggest difference and bring about the most change within our political system. And I think as Bernie Sanders chose in the 2016 presidential election, he was actually elected to Congress as an independent, mm-hmm. but he chose to run in the Democratic primaries and caucuses, and I think he had a much bigger impact on the race than he would have if he had run as an independent or a green or something like that. And similarly, I think it the way that I can have make the biggest difference and help make the greatest change is running as a Democrat. But I have not been a member of a political party over the course of my life. I've worked primarily as an independent watchdog, and that work has put me in a position of calling out Democrats and Republicans when mm-hmm. I've seen wrongdoing or unethical conduct. And I don't make any apologies for that work. I think it's valuable and important, and I'm proud of it. And in the end, I'm running for governor to serve the people of Wisconsin, not to serve a political party. I'm running for governor to try to make our state better because here's the thing. I wake up sometimes and I have a hard time recognizing Wisconsin as the place where I grew up. And I really think our state is slowly but surely becoming a shadow of its former self, and it breaks my heart. So that means we need really new leadership, a different kind of leadership than we've had here for quite some years.
Let's talk about some of those things that you see different. And I think, to comment quickly on what you were saying, I think the flip side of it is that you actually can be sort of a uniter in some sense of, we're not as divided. On some level, we're so divided. And then on some level, I think part of what you're saying is we're not as divided as we think because those core values still exist. So let's talk about some of those core values that you bring.
On that point you just made, our current governor has specialized in divide and conquer politics.
Yes.
He actually says it out
loud.
loud.
And he succeeds.
And he does. He gets people at each other's throats. He actively seeks to divide and conquer people. And I do have this background where I've lived in the country. I grew up on a farm. I've spent a couple of decades living a rural existence, but I've also lived in the city. So I've straddled those two worlds. And the fascinating thing to me is how much rural and urban people actually have in common, even though we're repeatedly told that we're enemies and that we have
Madison versus the rural.
Yeah, but what fascinates me is how much we actually have in common, and we need to look. We're not going to get our state to a better place if our state's largest city, for example,
Milwaukee,
fails. Wisconsin can't succeed if Milwaukee fails. But by the same token, we're not going to get the kind of government we desire by only winning in places like Milwaukee and Madison. We have to be able to compete in places like where I grew up, which was represented by Democrats in my youth and now votes overwhelmingly Republican. And so I really think there are ways to reach out to people who see each other as enemies and find common ground with them. But to me, what it all boils down to is I want our state to be a place where the phrase working poor disappears from our vocabulary. And that means a living wage for every worker. It means health care for all. It means debt-free education and job training for everyone. It means high-speed internet everywhere. We're 49th in the country in internet speed. How can we...
I just sort of shuddered at that statement.
How can we thrive in a 21st century global economy? How can we even fully participate in modern American life without that tool? And there are so many people who don't have it at all. Half of rural Americans don't have access to high-speed internet. And Wisconsin is no exception to that national rule. How can we thrive in modern times being 49th in the country in internet speed? So we're going backward in so many ways in Wisconsin. We are becoming a shadow of our former selves. And I just think that cries out for a very different vision of our state.
I appreciate that. And let's break down some of these issues. I know economics is a huge focus of Blue Jeans Nation, of the work that you've done that have brought you to a candidate for governor. Talk to us about what it means to be, a leader for the workers and for the regular people.
Yeah. Right now, Wisconsin is, so far in the 21st century, leading the nation in shrinkage of the middle class. And we have levels of economic inequality now in Wisconsin not seen in our state since the Great Depression. We're dead last in the nation in new business startups for 3 straight years now. And I think it's because our state has come under the spell of a philosophy of economic development that the people who currently control things at the Capitol have sort of rammed down our throats for decades now. It's a top-down approach that seeks to build a sturdy economy by showering tax breaks and state subsidies on a few thousand people at the top, a few huge corporations, one foreign conglomerate from Taiwan,
right,
with the hope that some of what they're given will magically filter down to the rest of us. And it hasn't.
Trickle-down economy doesn't work.
So I talk, what I call it geyser economics because economic prosperity actually gushes up. It doesn't trickle down. And we should be doing an about face in our whole strategy of economic development. Instead of trying to build it from the top down, we should focus on empowering people from the bottom up. And that's what brings me to boosting wages. Low wages are a killer for our economy. We've been propagandized for decades now that raising wages is a jobs killer. That's what the right has told us over and over again. But the reverse is true. Low wages are a killer for our economy. They suppress demand and they inhibit sales. You put more money in the pockets of working people, they have a funny habit of spending it. And when they spend it, somebody has to sell what they buy, and it actually stimulates the economy. Working people don't do what a lot of rich people do when you give them more. They stash it in Bermuda or the Cayman Islands in some tax haven, or they just pad their net worth with it. They actually take the money out of circulation. Working people, keep it in circulation and keep it recirculating.
Even not at the highest level. I mean, I think that I'm an attorney, for goodness sakes. I'm not. If you give me an extra $1,000 in my tax cut, I'm not going to go buy a television. It will go into my savings account. You don't
Good
even
for
need,
you.
Right, but you don't even need, that's face reality. This isn't even a conversation about the top 1%. Right. This is a conversation of even the top versus working class.
Yeah. A lot of people don't have the luxury of if an extra $1,000 comes their way, they've got so many things that are on the list that they need. And so they spend it, and it stimulates the economy. So we should be boosting wages, actively seeking to boost wages. I'm for a $15 an hour minimum wage. We should turn that minimum wage into a living wage, and then I want to see health care for all nationally. I want America to have a single payer Medicare for all approach to health care. But I'm running for governor, so I want to explore how Wisconsin can be a national leader that sets an example for the nation to follow. So I was the first candidate to come out for making Badger Care a public option that anyone in Wisconsin, regardless of income, could buy into. It's way more affordable than what's out there in the private insurance market. It doesn't carry with it these ghastly deductibles. The other day, Carousel, I ran into somebody who has a $15,000 annual deductible. And she said,
you'll never meet it.
She said, why do I even have insurance? Because I pay these monthly premiums that are increasingly unaffordable. But unless I get so violently ill or so badly injured that I land in the hospital for an extended stay, my insurance never kicks in.
Correct.
I pay for all of my medical care.
$15,000, that's insane.
Isn't that? I mean, I'd been hearing about $7,000, $8,000, $10,000 deductibles, and here I run into somebody with a $15,000 annual deductible, and she said, I pay for all of my medical care out of pocket, so I'm afraid to go to the doctor because I can't afford it. Well, that's what people are wrestling with out there, and so I the latest figures that I've seen show that Badger Care's overall cost is 38% lower than what's out there on average in the private insurance market, and it pays for medical care from the first dollar of expense. You actually get health insurance coverage, and so let's make it a public option for everybody. And I everywhere I go, I say Badger Care should be there for all Badgers, and things like that. And
that's what I mean. I don't need the $1,000 because I have government insurance.
Right.
If I didn't have health insurance, the $1,000 would make a huge difference.
Exactly.
Right.
And then I was able to work my way through school and come out the other end with $770 in student debt because past generations had made higher education so ridiculously affordable that I could work my way through school. And today the average student has $30,000 in debt, and I've run into kids coming out of school with $50,000, $80,000, $100,000, and I actually ran into one not too long ago with almost $150,000 in student debt. When are they ever going to put a down payment on a house? When are they ever going to be able to buy a car? And what does that do to our economy? What does that do to the home builders and the realtors and the automakers and the car dealers when you've got an entire generation that can't make those purchases for years, if not decades? That's what I mean about empowering working people to stoke demand from the bottom up.
It's bigger than just the economy then.
Yep.
So talk to us about, we were talking before the show a little bit about internet, and let's talk about infrastructure and your comment about the internet. And something that we talk about on this show that is really important to me is the complete lack of access to housing. And when you talk about workers, not only do you need to raise their wage, but you need to make sure there's a place where they can be at the end of the day and have access to it and not live in fear of homelessness, which is exactly what is happening on a consistent basis for way too many people here in Madison.
Yeah, mostly because of my wife, who's a social worker and worked with homeless families for decades and has worked advocating for affordable housing. I've been drawn into volunteering at homeless shelters and doing work mostly because of Maryland, but it sends shivers up your spine when you serve breakfast to homeless people and then help pack them a lunch to take to work. They're going to work, but they're homeless. And I think most people assume that homeless people don't have employment, And of course, there are remarkably complicated reasons. No two homeless people are alike. There are enormously complicated challenges that they face. But it is amazing how many times I've run into people who are homeless, sleeping on a bench or in a car, and they go to work every day. But they can't keep themselves in housing, and so many working people. You run into people with 2 and 3 jobs, and they can't stay in the middle class. They're still falling into poverty. That shouldn't be anywhere. I said at the outset of the conversation, to me, Wisconsin's aim should be to erase the phrase "working poor" from our vocabulary. That should be our goal,
It should be an oxymoron.
It should be an oxymoron. The whole notion of working poor should be a contradiction in terms. Well, it has to be our state's goal to make that so.
So what's your response to the governor's special session, not the current one, we can get to that in a moment, but the prior one that really seemed like an attack on poverty and people, low-income people, making it harder to qualify for food subsidies, making it harder to qualify for housing subsidies, all of these things of, are you familiar with the bills and the special? It was a big special session.
And we're not going to solve any problem by making people pee in a cup. This idea of demonizing people and drug testing people. If lawmakers really want drug testing for public assistance, they should all be drug tested themselves, and they shouldn't receive their salaries unless they pass drug tests. Because here's the thing. I started looking into this whole idea of drug testing for public assistance. 10 states around the country do it. In those 10 states, it's actually cost more to do the testing than they've saved in any public assistance payments. And here's one of the fascinating findings, is that when they drug test people who receive public assistance, that population actually shows less drug use than the general population. The percentage of public assistance recipients who test positive is lower than the general population.
So of everybody else.
So this all this kind of policy is doing is feeding myth and propaganda and demonizing poor people, raising money from big donors. It's not solving any problem. So we got to get to the root cause of what people are struggling with, and it's low wages, it's lack of access to health care, it's not being able to afford the kind of education and job training that they need, it's lack of access to tools, 21st century tools like high-speed internet. We got to address that, empower working people to do more for themselves and for each other. That's how we'll get a sturdy economy in Wisconsin. And it is a 180-degree opposite approach of the approach that currently is being followed by those who are in charge of the state capitol these days.
We're talking with Mike McCabe. He's a candidate for governor for the state of Wisconsin. We would love your questions or comments or thoughts. Give us a call. Join the conversation. Area code 608-256-2001. You can also send us a message on our Facebook page. Our page is A Public Affair, 89.9 FM, Madison. One more thing. There's so many pieces to talk about on the economy. But one thing I saw on your website, and I've seen you mention, saying collective bargaining is a civil right.
Yeah.
I don't know how I feel about that. Tell me more about that.
Well, one of the things I've said a lot is that I think the biggest problem with unions is they don't represent enough people. Right now in America, 1 in 10 workers actually has union representation. And if you take the public sector out of the equation, it's 1 in 15. 6% of American workers have union representation. And people should have the ability to gather together and speak with one voice and negotiate and bargain with an employer. And the ability to belong to a union should be expanded to more workers. It's not enough for Democrats to be pro-union. We've got to be pro-worker. We've got to have policies that are good for all working people in every sector of our economy, whether they are currently represented by unions or not, because most people, the vast majority of workers, don't have union representation. Mm-hmm. So to me, for workers, we need to first expand opportunities to get union representation, but then we also have to push policies that get them to a better place, even if they don't have union representation. We need to be pro-worker and aggressively pro-worker. Or we can follow this approach that has been followed now for decades, where we basically feed the rich and hope that the rich work some magic for the rest of us, which is only creating grotesque levels of inequality. And to me, the biggest single problem we face in Wisconsin and in America today, the one that is on the top of the list, is inequality, both economic inequality, political inequality, and social inequality. And the thing is the more politically unequal we become, the more it feeds economic inequality. And the more economically unequal we become, the more that feeds political inequality and social inequality. And so these forms of inequality feed off each other. And we've got to deal with those inequalities.
So as someone that we talk a lot about racial justice on the show, gender justice, I'm a pretty strong, outspoken feminist. How does that come into this? Because I feel like sometimes there's a tension when we talk about workers. We're talking about the white male worker. And how do you add that into that, especially when you talk about, civil rights? I feel like, but wait a second, you didn't talk about racism, you didn't mention sexism yet. How does that overlay and play a role in when you're looking at these policies?
I think here's another place where we have to steer clear of the divide and conquer politics that has been nurtured by those who are currently in power. They want to divide the white working class male from people of color or women. They want them to see each other as enemies, and because that way they can feed the rich,
sure,
and have the support to do it because they still have governing majorities. We have to see how our fates are tied together, and whether you're black and living in inner city Milwaukee, or you're a woman, or you are a white working class male, or you're a farmer, we've got a government that is pushing policies that are not good for you, but rather are really good for a wealthy and well-connected and privileged few at the very top. And if we reverse those policies and we start to think about how to create a geyser economics, a whole lot of people get better off, who are currently being told that they're enemies, and they're currently being put at each other's throats. And we have to be, I think, smart enough to see through the political tactics that have put a lot of us at each other's throats and made us see each other as enemies.
Are there any additional economic initiatives that you think would go, like people talk about Family Medical Leave Act and other issues, certainly the criminal justice system and the way that is used as a factor in housing and employment works against
I'd mention two things. First of all, we got lawmakers who seem bound and determined to resuscitate a 19th century industry like mining, which I don't think can be done these days in a way that isn't just destructive to our environment. But it's also largely a jobless industry now, and yet they keep trying to pass mining legislation to bring it back, and yet we're doing very little as a state to promote renewable energy development. There's this energy revolution going on in our country. Families are moving toward renewable energy. Businesses are moving toward renewable energy. And yet, as they push on the accelerator, our own government is hitting the brakes and saying, wait, not so fast. We got some drops of oil still to sell. And if Wisconsin was just doing as well as our regional neighbors here in the Great Lakes area in producing green energy jobs, 30,000 more people would be employed in that sector in Wisconsin if we were just at the regional average. So to me, there's this energy revolution going on, and we got to put our government on the side of the revolution and incentivize renewable energy development. That's a tremendous growth opportunity. And then you mentioned, in terms of the criminal justice system, we're spending more on prisons than we are on the whole university system in our state budget. And a big reason is that we're locking up people who haven't committed a violent crime or damaged any property. I've come out for full legalization of marijuana, for example. a second.
You were one of the first to do that.
I was the first candidate in the field to come out for full legalization, and now virtually the entire field has joined me. It was the same with Badger Care. I came out for Badger Care as a public option. Now pretty much everybody is saying we should have Badger Care as a public option. So we've changed the conversation, and that's great. But a second marijuana possession charge is a felony in Wisconsin. You can go to prison for a really long time for a second marijuana possession charge. And you look at a state like Minnesota, it imprisons half as many people as Wisconsin, yet our two states have virtually identical crime rates. So locking up twice as many people hasn't reduced crime or improved public safety or made our communities more secure. It's simply warehoused people, and at a huge expense to taxpayers. Minnesota emphasizes alternative approaches to sentencing, more mental health and drug treatment. That's what we should be doing in Wisconsin. And I think a great start would be legalizing marijuana. Let's stop putting people in prison when they haven't committed a violent act or damaged property. And that, boy, I tell you, you go to the 53206 zip code in inner city Milwaukee, and I've been going there repeatedly. It's the most heavily incarcerated zip code in America. In the whole country.
Really? I don't think I knew that.
It's the most incarcerated zip code in America, 53206. But the last time I was there, I also found out that the average home value is somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 in that zip code. Think about that. Think about what the local housing stock has how it's been allowed to deteriorate, and think about the conditions of the economy that would lead the average home value in a zip code like that to drop to those levels. And there's, again, where I would say we cannot succeed as a state if we allow places like that to fail. We're all in this together, and we cannot leave people behind, and that requires a change of political philosophy, because the people who control things at the Capitol right now are dedicated to a politics that does leave people behind, that doesn't believe that we're all in this together. It's a very greed-centered, self-oriented, self-interest-oriented politics, and we desperately need a we politics instead of a me politics.
We're talking with Mike McCabe, candidate for governor of Wisconsin. We put the call out for calls, and you called. So we have a couple people waiting. Thank you so much for waiting. Peter, we're going to start with you, a fellow county board supervisor from Sauk County. Thanks for calling again, Peter. What was your comment you'd like to add?
Well, thank you so much. I just want to support Mike, whom I know. There's no one who is more articulate in thinking about these issues and converting the thoughts into policy proposals than Mike, maybe Bernie, but these are the kinds of directions we need to head in here in Sauk County. We need to head in this direction in all of our counties in Wisconsin, and that has to do, as Mike says, with the legislature. So we have an opportunity coming up to truly impact in the name of the people and what is best for our state and hopefully what is best for our country to move from this very, very strange place we find ourselves in back to the more basic fundamentals of what American values have always been. There is a dark side. There is a bottom side to this American dream, and it is the American nightmare. And that is what we are living right now because people have forgotten that their voice is what defines the future. And I want to just applaud Mike for stepping forward in all of this.
Well, thank you for calling in and joining the conversation. Thanks. I'm sure Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sure Mikey, any follow-up to that?
Oh, well put. Well said.
We have another call coming in. Thomas, thank you. You've been waiting. You wanted to talk about Mike running as a Democrat.
Yes. I got two questions.
Okay.
I want to know if he's running on a Democratic ticket as a Democrat or if he's running independently, which may reduce the number of people that's going to vote both for him and for the Democratic Party. And the other one is regarding the bill probably just passed where the state Senate says local government, it can't control wages, benefits, so forth, particularly when they're doing contract work. And I think that's important because if we don't have any control, what difference does it make who we vote in locally, because they can't do anything? And I think that is evident by the governor and the president we have at the present time. They don't care about anybody except money and power. And so I'll hang up and listen to his response, and thank you for the program.
Thank you, Thomas. And I think that's AB 748. I have it memorized because I've been tracking that bill, and I believe the Senate may be voting on it this very moment.
Yeah. Real quickly, I am running as a Democrat.
Yes.
And I'm really an independent running in the Democratic primary. But if I ran as an independent, what he described is exactly what would happen. With somebody with my values, my positions on issues, who would I take more votes from in a general election? The current governor or the Democratic nominee? I probably would guarantee the re-election of our current governor. And I want a new governor. I think Wisconsin needs a new governor to become the state that we have the potential to be. So that means that the way that I can make the biggest difference is to pursue this as a candidate in the Democratic primary. He raises a wonderful and important point about local democracy.
Local control.
Exactly. Now, the party that currently controls the Capitol used to fancy itself as the party of local control, and now they are dedicated to controlling the locals. Just since 2011, over 130 laws have been made in Wisconsin that take away local decision-making authority in one way or another. And I've actually come out and said publicly on a number of occasions that we should repeal all of those laws and return to a 2010 understanding of local decision-making authority. They take away local communities' ability to have any say over these gigantic industrial farm operations, the drilling of high-capacity wells, the spreading of manure, lakeshore or shoreline development, sand mining. Local governments can't say anything. They can't set any rules about how sand mining is done in western Wisconsin. And now they're trying to take away a local community's ability to establish any sort of living wage or conditions of employment for people and worker protections. There's this assault on local community decision-making. They want to consolidate all the power in the Capitol, and I think it has everything to do with big money interests who don't want to have to go around to thousands of different local governments and try to influence them, but rather they want to just influence the governor and the state legislature and have them impose their will on communities around the state. So we have to get back to the idea of local community authority to make decisions and to decide what's best for those local communities.
So if you're taking this answer and changing it a little, if you were elected governor, what would be the balance of state leadership and local leadership? And then sort of a tangent on that is, if you were elected governor, or if any of your colleagues on the Democratic ticket were elected governor, they most likely would be working with a Republican legislature, a Republican assembly. I think that party, there's just too many Republicans in the assembly to flip it around.
Maybe for the time being.
Yes. So how do you work with local governments? How do you work with Republicans as the elected Democratic governor? How do you bring everyone together? I
did all that work for all those years for the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, and because I actually believe in the idea of democracy. And I don't think you can really believe in the idea of democracy and then say all power should be consolidated in the hands of 132 legislators and one governor. You have to give local communities the ability to have some say and to actually have some community decision-making authority. And so I'm a big believer in restoring local democracy. Also, for example, for years I took the position that the Department of Natural Resources should be headed by someone chosen by the Natural Resources Board, not handpicked by the governor. We should have an independent DNR to oversee and protect our environment. And I would stick to that position as governor. I would obviously have to appoint a DNR secretary immediately after being elected governor, but I would also work to change the process then to move toward an independent DNR that the governor would not have so much control over. Again, this is about decentralizing power, decentralizing control. And to me, that's a fundamental principle of democracy. I don't want all the power put in one person's hands. That's dangerous, and I don't care how enlightened that person is or how public-spirited that person is. It's not a good condition. So, and on your point about the legislature, I think it is important to remember that it's so critically important to win the governor's office because Wisconsin is a strong governor state, and in large part because of the partial veto authority. It's not a line item veto. It's much more extensive than that. A governor can literally take a sentence that says Wisconsin will not do this and turn it into Wisconsin will do this.
We'll do this.
And that gives a governor tremendous leverage. So even if we have a Republican-controlled legislature, that legislature will know that if I send them a budget reflecting my values and they send me back a budget that simply reflects theirs, I can turn it back into a budget that largely reflects my values. For example, I've taken the position that we should end taxpayer-subsidized private schooling, end the voucher program. I've also said that we should close the state's corporate welfare office, the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. If I send them a budget that ends funding for those two programs and they send me back a budget with full funding, I can veto that funding, zero it out, and they need 2/3 majorities in both houses to override my veto. I like my chances of prevailing if that's the case. But that also then gives me leverage with them. They don't have much choice but to work with me and to cooperate a little bit because they know that I would be able to do that. And so I think that it's important for people to remember that we need that balance of power. If we're going to have a Republican-controlled legislature, we desperately need a Democratic governor. If for no other reason, to veto the next redistricting plan that gerrymanders the states and the state and weakens and disempowers voters.
If you don't make it through the primary, do you know if you'll be supporting the Democratic individual, the person that makes it through the Democratic primary?
You know what I know for sure is that after August 14th, regardless of the outcome, win or lose, I'm going to continue to be out there working for this Wisconsin that I want to see. I'm going to continue to work, do everything in my power to get regular people in the driver's seat of our government and get Wisconsin working for all of us and not just those at the very top. And I actually think it's a mistake for Democratic insiders to dwell so much on things like loyalty pledges and endorsement promises, because your average voter out there couldn't care less about whether the Democratic candidates support each other. Their question is, can I trust a Democrat to actually work on my behalf? Can I actually trust Democrats to do what will be in my best interest? So all of our energy really should be focused not on simply party loyalty, but rather all of our focus should be about connecting with people who used to support Democrats but stopped, and making a case for why our vision of Wisconsin is way better for them than the vision that is currently being forced down our throats by those in charge at the Capitol. That's what we should be spending every minute of every day talking about. That, and that's what I'm going to talk about after August 14th, too.
And if you're elected governor, will you work with the Democrats?
Of course.
See, clarifying.
Of course. Of course. Yeah, you know, and look, I've even had people say, well, you haven't been a Democrat all these years. You know, you've been an independent, so you have no business running as a Democrat. And all I can say is, look, if that's a position people take, if you have to have been one of them forever in order to be able to run for governor, all I can say is if somebody with my values, with my positions on issues, doesn't have a place within the Democratic Party is going to have a really hard time ever getting to a governing majority in this state. We need to reach people who I think will respond to a very aggressive Democratic agenda, but who, for a variety of reasons, don't trust Democrats, don't like Democrats very much right now, and really feel that the Democratic Party has abandoned them. We need to reconnect with them, and we can do that. There's a great opportunity. An earlier caller talked about the wonderful opportunity that exists in 2018, and there is indeed an opportunity here to turn our state around, and I think it can happen.
Lowercase d instead of uppercase d.
That's what I think is needed.
Democracy.
Yep.
I have a question that I'm asking all of the candidates. I think one of my favorite questions to ask, so I'm going to ask you. Can you tell us, as someone that is, you've been the executive director of an organization, you are a candidate running for governor, you're clearly, a leader in our state and our community. Talk to us about the people that you have mentored and that you are bringing up the younger generation, the next generation, to follow behind you and follow in your footsteps so they can lead us as well.
Well, our campaign already has well over 700 people signed up as volunteers and are actively working in every part of the state, and a whole bunch of them are either college-age kids or high school students. And it is delightful to watch how their involvement in this campaign is adding to their understanding of how democracy works and is equipping them to become leaders down the road. And of course, I'm a father also of an 18-year-old son, and so any mentorship that I do starts right there at home, and that's my first responsibility. But then I'm able to work with so many young people who are involved in this campaign. The one thing I can confidently say about our campaign is we easily have the biggest grassroots volunteer operation in the state. There's of all the candidates in the field. It is inspiring to see all of what's going on in communities all across the state. What they're doing for this campaign is really both heartwarming to me and deeply inspiring. I try to act as an example for those young people, and if I can mentor them in some way, I will. But to me, Carousel, I see young people finding their voice on their own. You see this whole thing about the response to the latest mass shooting in Florida, how young people are finding their voice.
Absolutely.
And they are
leading.
They are changing the whole national conversation about gun violence. They are leading. And I say lead the way. I'm not sure they need me as much as we all need them.
I wanted to ask you about the special session that is actually... Now, this is the second special session we're talking about, how to keep track, specifically on gun control and on access to guns. Do you have any position or thoughts on, that's certainly the question on everybody's minds these days, how do we keep our schools safe, but how do we keep our communities safe?
Yeah.
And Governor Walker's proposals, which include funding to provide armed security at schools.
But steer is entirely clear of dealing with
correct
gun violence and all the various gun issues. I've actually come out in favor of 16 different measures that wouldn't stop law-abiding people from hunting or owning guns, but would really enhance safety and security and deal with the issue of gun violence. And it's things like comprehensive criminal background checks and getting rid of bump stock so you can't turn a regular gun into a machine gun, limiting the size of magazines. There's no way somebody who hunts needs a 30-round magazine to fire off 30 rounds in a matter of seconds. If you need that to hunt, you're a really bad hunter. And I grew up in the country. I grew up around hunting. There's all these steps we can take, and the special session deals with none of them. And I think what it comes down to is we'll never get more than thoughts and prayers after each new mass shooting from elected officials when they are paid not to take any other action, when they are under the spell of the NRA. And so it again brings me back to that root problem that we have to deal with, is the way our system has been commandeered by these big money interests, and we have to do that. We won't get clean air and clean water from dirty politics. We won't get living wages from a dying democracy. We won't get good health care from a sick political system. We won't get any of the things we want and need for our state to become what it has the potential to be unless we deal with the cancer that's growing in the body of our democracy.
Well, and I think there's no better illustration of the money in politics than the power of the NRA.
No better illustration. That is a perfect illustration of what happens to a government when it comes under the spell of big money interests.
It's clearly not the political
what
will
the public
at all.
wants, what the
Right.
public wants, the public officials will not give us because they are owned. And that's got to stop.
Well, I know there's so many more issues we could talk about. We didn't talk in detail about education. We didn't talk very much about the environment. You talked a little bit about it on the job scale, and I know there's more. But just I want to thank you for joining us today. There's so many more things we can talk about, but I really appreciated the opportunity to talk in detail about what we did have time to cover.
Absolute pleasure doing it. I thank you for having me.
So in sort of our final moment here, your final pitch for people that are listening, why should they be supporting you for governor when they vote in August?
Oh, we have to have a government that is able to work for all of us and not just those at the very top. And that does mean a new kind of politics. It does mean walking the walk. We can't simply say that we think the political system is fouled up and then play along with that system. We actually have to win elections by standing up to that system. We can't play along with the system and then expect to change it after the elections are over. And everything I've done for my whole adult life has led me to the point of saying we're at a crisis point, and I offer that kind of vision and leadership for our state, and I think it's the way that we get out of the rut that Wisconsin is currently in.
Well, it's been really a pleasure having you again. I loved having you in 2014. I think that was the last time. I can't believe it was so long ago. But it's really been great having you and talking with you and getting a better understanding of the vision that you have for the state of Wisconsin. And I just want to thank you for joining us today.